Well, it's lovely to welcome you back, Forrest. Today we're going to be having a conversation about money and power, which may become a conversation that also involves artificial intelligence. So perhaps money, power, and artificial intelligence. And I wanted to begin by asking you to share your thinking about, in part, what money is, but perhaps how can we think about it a little bit deeper than usual? How can we think about it in the context of the incentives that are present in our economic system, which also condition how we think about money? So what money is and how we've also come to think about it.
Well, in this notion of deepening, what is money? What is value, basically? There's a book called Debt 5,000 Years. And that's been a very good reference for people to sort of really understand the notion of monetary systems and things like that. But I found myself more often thinking in terms of value and the capacity to get things done. So in a sense, one direction that I've found to be very fruitful is to think about money in terms of not just resources and things like that, but the capacity to create order in the world, to implement choices. So, for example, if I had a bunch of money given to me as a founder of a startup, for example, I could take that and I could invest it into building materials and make a new factory. So in a space where there was essentially disorder, that now I have essentially created order. I've created a building and a whole process by which a particular kind of thing can occur. So in this sense, there's a notion of thinking about monetary systems in terms of how they store and also enable choice. So you think about, a dollar as being the capacity to purchase a good or a service, but it's really to choose which good and which service, when that would be deployed and how that would work. So in one sense, we can think about money in terms of a choice process, in terms of a kind of representation or proxy for a choice process. People that have money have more choices in a certain sense. Whereas another dynamic which I've found useful in terms of thinking about money is to think about energy. Nate Hagen's brought this one to my attention. And he basically was noticing that in pretty much every epoch, we can sort of talk about how energy can be not just a token of something that is exchanged, like we could treat, a given amount of oil as having a certain amount of worth, but really the monetary system's defined in terms of the energy rather than the energy, in a sense, paid for by a monetary system. So in other words, if there's an equivalence between being able to get something done, being able to make a change in the world, that at some point or another, that change is going to involve energy. That choice is going to manifest. The potentiality is going to become actuality. That is an energy transition. So in this sense, moving our thinking from monetary systems to energy systems or to choice dynamics has actually been very liberating in terms of how to think about this sort of process. A third lens, which I have found to be extremely helpful in terms of thinking about monetary systems, is to think about game theory. So, in any sense, any market system is a little bit like a game. In fact, it's a lot like a game. You're going to have winners and losers. You're going to have people who are more skillful in terms of how they manage it and how they don't. And over time, you're going to see essentially these forces that emerge as a result of the game process itself. So, in a certain sense, you could treat the stock market, or you could treat the global economy as a little bit like a game, much the same way that you might think of, some slot machine in Vegas as being a game. So, you can invest, but it's speculative and you don't necessarily know in advance, what's going to happen. I mean, you can influence the behavior of the market to some extent, particularly if you're, in the market as a manufacturer or as a, producer of some sort or another. But there's a sense in which the game dynamics and the way we think of market process as a kind of play between actors is again, it's a clarifying concept. So I find that between these three notions, thinking about monetary process in terms of what choices it is and what choices that facilitates or doesn't, and how those choices essentially manifest. Thinking about it in terms of energy dynamics and energy flows, and then finally thinking about it in terms of game dynamics and game flows. And this isn't to say that I have a preference that, we should think in terms of money fundamentally, but just that when I find myself needing to think about monetary process, I find that these three lenses, I'm going to want to use each of them in turn to just make sure that I've thought through the fundamental issues clearly. If we just think about it in terms of a habitual, notion of a store of value or things like that, then you tend to kind of get locked into thinking about it as a fiat currency or some sort of cryptocurrency, or things like hard assets as gold or land and stuff like that. Whereas as more fundamentally, there's a sense in which we're wanting to really look at the dynamics of the process itself rather than its particular manifestation or particular implementation. Otherwise, we're not really getting at the heart of the matter as far as I can see.
Why do you think inequality is such a profound aspect of our present system? And do you see it as something which has been, of course, it seems like it's been increasing drastically. I don't know, relatively speaking, if someone could make an argument that X number of 100,000 years ago, it might have been comparable. It seems like that we're approaching the era of trillionaire individuals, let alone trillionaire organizations. All the while, house prices are becoming increasingly unaffordable for people. It seems as though inequality is increasing drastically, and it's one of the most important signals that our present world is becoming less livable for the majority of humans. Why do you think inequality is such a dynamic at present?
Yeah, this is actually a very excellent question, and thank you for asking this. There's several factors that are contributor factors, but there's kind of an underlying overall dynamic that's sort of operating below or behind the scenes. And so to speak about this, I'm going to have to fill in quite a bit of information. One thing that we can notice, for example, is that it's kind of in the nature of game dynamics itself to raise the degree of inequality in, like, if I have 100 players and the game itself is essentially going to prefer to have a small number of winners relative to the number of losers, then the mere action of playing the game is going to, in effect, going to create a kind of inequality. So in one sense, we can say, well, inequality results from game dynamics because in a given population, not everybody is going to be equally good at every game. And so as the nature of the game changes, the number of the people that are particularly good at the game are going to basically vary depending upon, all sorts of random factors. But the thing here too that is particularly important is not just, is it the case that inequality is increasing? You're asking me that, and I'm basically going to say, yes, it is definitely the case that the level of inequality has increased significantly. It used to be that if you were to look at the amount of, like, you have a graph and it's, kind of ranking on the x-axis along the bottom, the poorest to the richest. And then you had essentially how high on the graph would be, what percentage of the total prosperity of the world or the nation state or something like that. And it used to be that you'd end up with a graph that kind of had, sort of a sloping curve, on the right side where you had the more prosperous people, they'd have more percentage of the whole. But nowadays, that graph over time kind of started to do this sort of hockey stick kind of thing. And now if you look at it, it's basically like a right angle. You see essentially nothing until you get all the way into the right-hand side, and then all of a sudden it's a vertical line. It's basically not even representable as a graph anymore because you can't even see it because the thing is hugging the x-axis, and then all of a sudden it's hugging the right wall. And, you could say, well, what is it that's increasing that? Like, what happened? And there's this really famous graph that I think it was like the New Yorker or something like that put out a number of years ago. And you can see year by year how this graph changes. And it's like all of a sudden you see this spike on the right side go up, and then it just keeps going up and up and up. And, when did that start? Well, it was, sometime in the late 70s, early 80s. And you say, well, what was it that was going on at that time that would create such a different dynamic that would essentially become more and more efficient at extracting wealth from the base population and increasing it and consolidating it in a very small number of winners, essentially. And you know, the joke is done with computers, but it's actually networks too. It's both computers and robotic processing, automation, networks such as the internet, and kind of the interaction between computers who can process information, automation processes in factories, which can make, factories more productive. And then, obviously the networks that allow us to essentially copy information around and to sort of look at network effects. It's basically a sort of a compounding exponential aspect. So anywhere that you can look at a kind of exchange system, we can exchange tokens back and forth. That would be like an additive. Every token I give to you is subtracting from my pool and adding to yours. Or you can look at it in terms of a multiplicative process. If somebody is charging, taxes on the transaction, so each transaction they get a percentage. So the number of tokens that you earn might be based upon something like rent, where you're getting a certain amount on the basis of just the fact of money moving in the world. And then there's an exponential thing, which is like if you are extracting a percentage of every transaction that occurs, but then you build a marketplace that creates a need for that transaction, then all of a sudden your earnings are going to be proportional to the number of people transacting, which of course can increase much quicker than anything you can do individually. So, between these sort of foundations between additive process, multiplicative process, which would be like earning an interest rate, for example, if you're a bank or something like that, versus producing an entirely new marketplace, the people that are earning the most are going to be in the marketplace creators. So in this sense, this is part of the reason why there's been so much interest in cryptocurrency, is because, anybody who proposes a coin and manages to get that to actually become the transactional basis for a thing is in effect going to really do very well, because they were the people that created the game that is that particular token exchange. So in this sense, we're looking at the use of machinery, right? In this particular instance, to create new dynamics, new processes, whether it be manufacturing processes or marketplace systems or just communication between individuals. And that the earning potential based upon the number of people playing in those new systems is in effect going to be exponential. So it's going to be of that third kind. It's not going to be they're charging a percentage. They're charging a percentage on every transaction that happens. So in this sense, if you're just looking at the automation process and the computer automation, hardware, software side of it, and then the networking side of it, and then the marketplace side of it, then in effect you end up with a much, much stronger extractive potential. In other words, you're using technology to increase the rate at which you can extract value from the common people. So of course it's not just something that you can see in the data. You can see it happening in the data for sure. It's like this line just goes up and up and up, and it just every year the steepness of it increases until like now it's essentially so steep that we've never seen anything like this before. Not in human history, that is. So in effect, there's a sense of, yes, the Gini coefficient, the level of inequality is absolutely increasing. We can absolutely associate it with the use of technology, much the same way that, back in the 1700s, for example, an individual fisherman could only really basically fish to the extent of what he could build, a boat and, whatever fishing line, spear, harpoons, or whatever. Whereas nowadays you have, basically large, not just yachts, but like boats that are designed with huge motors, and they could put out a mile of net and capture fish at a rate that would basically dwarf that would be done by an entire village in the 1700s. Like you probably need an entire city's worth of fishermen to create the same amount of fish caught per hour of fishing, as say a modern trawler would be able to do, and using essentially one or two people. So in this sense, technology itself acts as an extremely strong amplifying factor in the ways and the rapidity. So in other words, it's not just how quickly we can extract. It's also the sheer number of different kinds of things that have been monetized. Like at a certain point, attention wasn't really something that people would spend a lot of time back, 200 years ago. You might write a book if you wanted to, but, you'd have to be pretty serious to even get that to happen, and not that many people would read it anyways. Still a lot of people reading books, but if you look at the internet and how social media works, attention is now a commodity. And so, advertisers buy attention. They buy the number of views of a particular article or views of a particular advertisement or something like that. And they're basically, treating your attention as a monetizable resource. Whereas previously that wouldn't have been the case. And this is it's an example, but there are hundreds of things that previously would not have been monetized, which are now in one way or another converted into value. So anything that can be converted into something that would have the Uberization of someone's process, like, the whole Airbnb thing, that was a commercialization of space that people used to use as guest space for friends and family, for example. Now, if you look at the sheer number of new markets created, the sheer number of people participating in those markets, multiplied now by the number of markets. So if you increased from, say, the 70s to today, that now all of a sudden there's 1,000 markets relative to what then was one, right? And the number of people participating in each of those markets is increasing by, some huge amount. And the number of transactions in each of those markets is increasing by some huge amount. And the technology is essentially even better at extracting more and more from each of those transactions. So in other words, you end up with, for every individual transaction, there's an algorithm that's now calculating what's the most that they can charge you. Like the mere fact that you're walking into the store with a cell phone, there's ways that the owner of the store can figure out, oh, he's needing to buy X and he's desperate because of situation Y, and therefore we're going to charge him more than we would have. You get individualized pricing. I'm kind of just creating scenarios, but stuff like this has happened. It's not like I've made this up as essentially something I think about. It's something I saw reported, right? So in effect, you multiply these factors together. The degree to which technology can effectively do custom pricing to extract more in a more coherent way, the number of people that it's extracting from in each marketplace, the number of transactions that are occurring, and the sheer diversity of the marketplaces. And you put all that together and you're creating one hell of a game, basically, one constellation of games, each of which essentially advantages the winners over the losers. So in effect, the level of inequality increases going up because of all of these reasons. So this is essentially the surface picture. And you'll notice that nothing that I've said has anything to do with, individual bad actors who have bad political points of view or things like that. We're just talking forces in the world that, operating unchecked, can't help but result in this outcome, right? Like it's like basically trying to blame gravity, as a political ideology. It's like gravity doesn't know anything about politics. It's just going to be what it is. And so in effect, there's a kind of, when we think about everything in terms of transaction and power, and we don't think about things in terms of care, and that's a triple, by the way. There's a sense in which these three concepts of care, transaction, and power are deeply related to one another. They're not divisible. They're always going to be entangled in some way. So in effect, there's a notion here that because we as a modern people, and I'm talking about like literally not just all of Western civilization, but largely the East as well. I mean, Eastern civilization or countries, China, for example. I mean, it's like all of these worlds, all of these nation states are basically operating on the basis of some interplay between transactional process, what we think of as a monetary system, and some sort of power-based process, i.e. some sort of hierarchy, whether it be democratic or maybe a dictatorship or something. But either way, the dynamics are fundamentally institutional, which effectively is going to be, a geometry of who has power when, under what circumstances, and who has which resources win under what resources, and how choices occur is going to be largely defined by power and transaction rather than being defined by care. And so, of course, things go wrong, right? I mean, it's like if you look at that kind of fundamentally, then you're basically saying, well, the tools that we're using aren't giving us the outcomes that we want. Like the things that we care about, the things that matter are not happening because the underlying forces inherent in the very nature of the tools of transaction and power can't help but create these kinds of outcomes. It's a bit like saying, I want to climb to the moon, but I can't get there using a ladder. It just, there's nothing to lean it on. So in effect, there's a situation here where the tools we're using just won't give us the outcome that we're looking for because we just don't understand the nature of most people. I'm basically saying have throughout their entire lives have been steeped in the ocean of transactional methodologies and power-based methodologies. Our entire social graph is mostly defined by power geometries and transactional geometries in one sort or another. People are born into this world, hopefully in the care of their parents, and leave this world, hopefully in the care of their children. But for the most part, the rest of our lives is defined largely by transactional and power dynamics. And so in this sense, it's not too surprising that we haven't learned as human beings how to navigate the world on the basis of care. So in this sense, there's this sort of inequality thing happening as an outcome of the nature of transactional power process altogether. But there's a deeper thing, which are when you say, why is it the case that concern about inequality is increasing? Well, you could say, well, that could be the case because the level of inequality has increased so much that the level of choice making is now so uneven and takes in so little of the information that would be needed and has so little capacity to hold care in its fundamental nature that it just tends to make bad choices. It tends to make very destructive choices. And that as a result, the world becomes more and more hostile to life, particularly human life. I mean, like at this particular point, it's definitely hostile to every other species. At this point, the biomass of human beings exceeds that of all other mammals combined. So, at this point as a species, we've been, as successful as is possible to be. At this particular point, you could eradicate, all other species on Earth that are mammals. Obviously, there's a lot more bacteria and bugs and things, but, there's a sense here in which that would be really terrible. But in effect, we're already more than halfway there. And so in effect, there's a sense here in which we're saying, okay, we've noticed that the degree to which the outcomes that are occurring are wildly in deviation from things that actually matter to us, quality of life and stuff like that. On one hand, modern technology has been super successful, but it's beginning more and more to seem to be producing terrible outcomes. And the degree of inequality is just one of those. And so you could say, well, what is it the case? Are we interested in inequality because it's gotten to the point that it's disabling of choice, or are we interested in inequality because it's become completely disabling to the kinds of outcomes that would be the world we'd all want to live in? And the answer to those questions is certainly true, but it turns out that there's actually an even deeper reason that's supporting all of this. And I've mentioned it a few times in other conversations, but effectively, from the research work that I did back in the 90s, one of the things that came out of that was essentially an awareness that reality itself, the notion of the real, is that which is at once choice, change, and causation. This is roughly the equivalent of basically saying that if you want to understand the universe, you need to understand creation, existence, and interaction. It's really a basic statement. It's not like actually that controversial. But in the same sort of way that you're missing big pieces of what the universe is about if you don't know anything about interaction or anything about existence or anything about creation. If you have no information about those three topics, you don't know anything about the universe. But you will know something about the universe if you know everything about those three topics. And so we come into this notion of the real as being change, causation, and choice. I'm going to list them in a slightly different order. Because in the overall grand arc, epochal timeline of history. So you look back at, well, not history, but human evolutionary dynamic, right? So So, we've been on this earth roughly 200,000 years or so, or so many, it depends on how you want to categorize what's a human being, basically. But at some point or another, you have tribal society before language, even like we're talking at around the time that fire was maybe discovered, right? That would be kind of like one of the prototypical technologies, along with things like clubs and spears and stuff. But the idea here is that at that time, humanity had to live in nature, and nature is nothing other than change. It's like everything is changing. The weather's changing, the seasons are changing, your biology is changing, the which species are where is changing. Like, you have to basically learn to live in flow with that change. Otherwise, your skillfulness just isn't adequate enough to survive. So all of the people that are our ancestors going back, 50,000 years are people that had to have developed a kind of mastery of learning to live in flow. And if you look at the earliest religions, the shamanistic sort of origins of, even things like Sanskrit or, Hindu kind of traditions or Buddhism and stuff like that, all of these notions are connected back to this idea of living with flow, living in balance. And so you could say, well, okay, the early hominid, the very earliest human beings were very, very skillful, have a mastery of living with change. And then as you come into the modern era, the last 5,000 years, particularly, or 15,000 years, if you want to think about things like plows and stuff. But, as we come into the modern era, we have basically treated mastery of causation as being the thing to do. So science and technology fundamentally science is the study of causal patterns, learning. It's a method by which we learn causal patterns, and we've gotten very good at representing those causal patterns using things like mathematical equations. And then technology is the application of those causal patterns to do things in the world. So basically everything that's associated with the modern world, the very notion of modernism itself even, is associated with mastery of the causation. So in effect, there's a sense in which not only is it the case that all of our technology depends on causation or causal patterns, but that the notion of modernism is the belief. I'm going to define it very strictly. Modernism is the belief that all problems could be solved using causal techniques. Now, that basically meant that progress was something like the more that we can separate ourselves from nature, this chaotic change, and put ourselves into systems, into, bureaucracies and governments and, organized civilization, the better off we're going to be. And to a large extent, for a long time, that worked. There's a book, on the other hand, called The Collapse of Complex Civilizations, written by Tainter, which describes this curve that basically says at first you put energy in and you get a lot more energy out. You drill a hole in the ground that requires a certain amount of effort. You got to put some energy in, but then all of a sudden oil starts gushing off and you can burn the oil to do whatever you want, including drill a whole bunch more wells. And at a certain point, it doesn't come gushing out of the ground. You got to, go down there and put a pump in and then pump it out, right? Or eventually you have to, take tar sands and compress them and heat them up and something to get the oil out. So eventually you have to put more and more energy in to get the energy back. So for example, if you're thinking about solar energy, for example, how much energy does it cost? In terms of the manufacturing effort, like if I've got to take silicone and, take sand and melt it down to make a perfect crystal that I can then slice into wafers to make solar cells out of, that's a pretty energy intensive process. I mean, getting something to the point where it's literally sand melted, that's a tremendous amount of energy. Like, think of how many solar panels you would need to make a furnace like that run. So in this particular sense, we're saying, how much energy of formation, how much embodied energy is in our technology that we're using versus how much energy does it give back? And remember earlier, I was talking about financial systems in the sense of choice-making capacity. And I also talked about it in the sense of energy. And then I also talked about it in terms of game theory. So we're really looking at the intersection of these methods, right? So in the same way that causal processes you can think of energy on this sort of yield curve, like at first, a little bit of energy gives you a lot of energy back, or a little bit of organization makes things a lot easier. The same is true for choice, right? As you come into the modern era, it was very easy to make certain kinds of choices and to get a lot of yield from those. Nowadays, it's actually quite difficult to make a good choice and have it produce something that's high yield. Ask any startup founder now how much harder it is to basically make a startup work. And it's just the sheer number of things we need to calculate in and compensate for and to account for in all the different ways. Like the world that Gen Z lives in is easily thousands of times more complex than the worlds that their grandfathers were born into. So, and that's not just socially, that's also economically, it's a technology stack. It's like every single thing, even psychology, the amount of psychological understanding that somebody under 30 needs to have about the world to actually be able to operate in any real sense is 2 orders of magnitude higher than even their grandparents, let alone their parents, like 10 times the magnitude of their parents. They need to be that much more adept. And, so in effect, there's a crushing burden of complexity associated with the causal patterns that effectively is now making it harder and harder and harder to make good choices. So in effect, there's a sense here in which our choice-making capacity is following this same tainter curve, because no matter how perfect you are at using causation, that's not the same as making a good choice. And so when we're thinking about inequality, the thing that we're noticing is that it's an inequality of choice-making process. But even for those that have the choices, the sort of uber rich trillionaire type class, that even if you were to have, 12 advisors that were speaking to them the most intelligent advice you could possibly give 24/7, right? So you have these 12 streams of people chatting at you with the best advice they could possibly give. Now, obviously, no human being can take in 12 streams of conversation simultaneously, particularly if it's, complicated and sophisticated analysis. But even those 12 advisors would need 12 advisors speaking to them the same way, right? So you need 2 or 3 orders of that in order to be able to ingest enough information to be able to make a choice with the level of impact that a trillionaire would actually have. Like a trillionaire could literally, shape the lives of 1 billion people. And, in this particular sense, the notion of a good choice versus a bad choice would normally require the wisdom of millions or billions of people. But at this particular point, there's no way that any single individual is ever going to have the wisdom of 100 people, let alone 1 trillion people, right? So in this particular sense, there's a deep incapacity for us to not only balance the energy equation or balance the choice equation or to have the information flows result in anything that would be choices that would actually work. It's that the very premise of the idea that causation could be used to solve all problems is itself false. Right? In the same way that no matter how perfect your mastery of living in nature is not going to be able to prevent you from being run over by a bulldozer, right? Like, what is a tree going to be able to do against a bulldozer? What is any civilization going to be able to do against nuclear technology or modern weapons? It's a non-start. No tribe with, no matter how brave or capable or skillful their warriors with bows and arrows is ever going to be able to take on, a modern assault team with AK-47s, right? And so in effect, there's a sense here in which you're basically looking at a different kind of game when you move from working in the mastery of the world of flow, of change, to working in the mastery of the world of causation, which is what the world now is, right? We as a species have developed a mastery of the skill of causation. But you know what we don't have? We don't know anything about choice, right? Until the metaphysics, until I was able to basically derive essentially a notion of choice independent of an assumption that choice comes out of causation, I don't think there was any person in the world that genuinely understood what choice was, understood how it works, right? And so in effect, and it's not a system, it's not a thing that you can point at, you can describe in terms of causal language or mathematics. You need a different tool set in order for it to be coherent. So no matter how skillful you are in navigating change, it didn't make you an expert in navigating causation, right? Indians didn't become scientists, even if they lived in a world where they're experiencing physics all the time, right? Throwing the spears or jumping over rocks or whatever. And then when they basically got to the point where the modern world learned how to navigate the world of causation super, super well. Now all the problems that we're encountering all have to do with choice. Think about it. All of the issues that the world's facing today in one way or another have to do with our incapacity to make choices at scale in a good way, right? Pollution, you mentioned inequality, global warming, wars. I mean, like literally every single problem the world is facing is the residual class of the kinds of problems that causation cannot solve. If it could have solved, if bureaucracies and government systems and institutions and the financial instrumentation and all of the ways in which we think about cryptocurrency, if any of those things could have worked, if religion could have worked, if any of those kinds of things was the way, we would have used it already. There would be some nation that was basically doing those things that would be hyper successful and would have outcompeted every other nation on the planet. And this wouldn't even be a conversation. They would already have basically done the right thing. So the mere fact that these problems are still around basically means we're not thinking about it properly. And to do that, we have to let go of the idea that modernism is going to solve the problem, because it isn't. The belief that causation can solve all problems is demonstrably false, because we have problems that modernism can't solve. And so postmodernism is essentially pointing at things like consent. That's a choice aspect. Inequality. That's a choice aspect. All sorts of things. Like every single thing that postmodernism as a philosophy is pointing to is traceable 100% of the time directly back to a failure of modernism to be able to describe choice, to be able to implement choice at scale. So therefore, we can say that the actual issue of inequality is not just because we're using modernism, i.e., power dynamics and transactional systems or causal dynamics associated with them, because all game systems are essentially a kind of proxy for a causal system. It's a made-up universe for causal dynamics to occur in. We're basically trying to do choice using causation as a basis. We're trying to get care to influence what happens through a system and a dynamic that fundamentally can't. So you end up with things like AI psychosis, where people believe that the machine cares about them or cares about, what you're interested in. But really all it's doing is simulating care. It's simulating, like it'll tell you what it believes you want to hear, not what the truth is, not what is actually right, not what's good for you or healthy or enabling in some fundamental sense. It's going to do essentially the thing that any psychopath will do. It'll tell you what you want to hear so that it can get what it wants. In this case, whatever the corporation that wrote the AI wants, which ultimately is probably going to be more money and power. But no matter how much money and power you have, if you don't care, then it doesn't matter. And so at some point or another, there's a point here where we run out of the kinds of things that we can do effectively with causal techniques and any of their descendants, which includes money and power as an example, as a proxy. And so all of the forces that are arriving out of the game dynamics, all the forces that are arriving out of the energy dynamics and so on and so forth, the Tainter curve and so on and so forth, is the inevitable consequence of using too much causation and not enough care, and not understanding the relationship between choice, change, and causation fundamentally. For that, you need the metaphysics. And that's not a physics, and it's not a math, and it doesn't look like those kinds of things, because if it did, it wouldn't work. It's like the very nature of the problem, the meta crisis that we're facing, is of a different order than the kinds of things that we perceived previously. And so if we're genuinely looking for solutions to things like inequality or pollution or global warming or any of the other disasters that happen as a result of the over-application of causation, believing that if we do the same thing over and over again, maybe this time it'll be different, that is insanity. That is essentially not understanding what is actually going on. You have to step back a little bit, let go of the preconceived ideas that causal patterns can solve with these problems, and try something different, genuinely different. And in this particular case, we're kind of up against the wall in time. So you can't just try shit by random anymore. You got to actually understand what's going on and do the right thing the first time. So that's where we're sitting. And at this particular point, I'm just essentially a person on the sidelines that's kind of observing all this and eating popcorn.
Okay. So with some of the language and thinking that you've shared, I'm curious how you would tightly define capitalism. I was going to give it a go, but maybe I can just ask you, would you see, I'll say, just to give you a sense of how I would have a go at it, would capitalism be the most effective way to play the game of power and transaction? Is it the game that is constituted by power and transaction given a sort of dissociation from care?
Have you ever read a book called Finite and Infinite Games by James P. Carse? Okay, so you know that in that book, there's essentially a comparison between finite games and infinite games.
Yeah.
And you also know that in my world, I tend to work in threes and have kind of understood things in terms of fundamental triplication and discovered that that is just way more useful for solving problems and figuring stuff out. What do you think the third would be between finite and infinite games? What would be the third class?
So the thing is that I don't know if I've heard you say this before, or that I know it's one of the mystery answers that reveals itself. You often say design.
Yeah.
I believe.
Oh, yes. You have heard me do this before, right? So when you're asking me, well, which is better, capitalism or socialism in the finite game of world economic process or world governance process, my first answer is, well, can we upgrade from a finite game to an infinite game, right? Because the notion of keeping playing is clearly important as far as market things are concerned. Because if the market crashes, nobody's playing anymore. It's
totally.
that's kind of bad for everybody, right? So you can ask a
Hence
question
when I said dissociation from care. So I'm on the right lines.
You're with me. You're with me. I get it. So the question though. So let's translate the question, right? So the first thing we say is, well, we want to upgrade from a finite game way of thinking about it to an infinite game way of thinking about it. So then I could say, well, does capitalism or socialism, which one crashes less often? And, the record on that's actually pretty clear, I think. I mean, it looks like socialism crashes a little bit more often than capitalism, although it's kind of close, right? So and that's just, a speculative evaluation on my part. But of course, I'm thinking, okay, well, actually, both of them tend to do rather badly at being infinite games. Like there's a sense in which the level of inequality emergent is huge in both. And that in this particular sense, it's kind of like, okay, well, if capitalism is essentially roughly the idea that we're going to try to figure out how to make choices in the world on the basis of who has the stuff, okay, the capital, basically. And socialism is some ideal of, well, we're all going to try to figure it out together. But what really happens in practice is that some committee gets elected and eventually becomes a way better game player than all the rest of the people in that system until the point that they basically own the system in some perfect hierarchy. Now, in both cases, there's a kind of failure mode that arises because the choices that are being made tend to be bad. And as a result, the thing crashes because basically greed's a phenomenon, right? Like if you're studying human psychology and you don't account for the fact that, frankly, we are all hungry and we all want to basically have families and produce offspring, at some point or another, you're going to actually need to account for the fact that the fundamental instincts of humanity are social process, which supports survival process, which supports sexual process, and that in turn supports social process. Like there's a ring there, right? These three instincts kind of need to go together, right? You can't really have one without the other two. Now, if we don't really look at the reality of the fact that those instincts are operating and we don't account for how they shape the playing field, then in effect, both capitalism and socialism are basically just driven straight into the ground immediately. Like when I say immediately, I'm talking like, maybe a few generations of people at the outside, roughly 200 years on a nation state basis, right? So, in effect, we're noticing that we want another alternative. I mean, like I'm not particularly in favor of either socialism or capitalism. I think we need a new option. And it's the kind of thing like, well, are you Republican or are you Democrat? Well, right now I don't want to be either one. They're both terrible. Okay. I mean, like honestly, people are are basically saying this is the worst possible version of the Democratic Party and the worst possible version of the Republican Party. We need an alternative to some sort of gladiator contest where the gladiators are all criminals. Like, and the spectacle of it is not helping us. So in effect, there's a sense here in which it's kind of like we want to step back and really look at what are the driving processes rather than asking a question of, well, can we improve capitalism to the point that it's free from flaws? It's kind of like, well, unless you can show me that you genuinely understand what went wrong in the first place, I don't believe in your solution, right? An incremental improvement on capitalistic process or market-based process or new financial instruments or new crypto tokens and so on and so forth. Like 99 times, I used to have it be the case. I don't solicit these anymore, but a lot of times, people would bring proposals to me. They'd say, hey, we have this new project. We have this new cryptocurrency. And I'd ask a few basic questions along the lines of, what does this problem solve? What does this thing a solution do? And then I would, do the thing that Daniel would do, which would be just ask a few really basic questions. He was great at this technique. It was actually what got me into his world, essentially, was he would ask a few questions and as soon as you ask the question, it would be like obvious. Like, if somebody says we're going to try to solve, something to do with the military industrial complex, you'd ask, okay, so, once you do your thing, what do you do with that leftover military industrial complex? It doesn't just go away. So what do you have it be in service to? And if they had never even thought of that question, you knew they weren't thinking about things. So at that point, we got to get to the place of, are we even asking the right questions? And you, of course, know that I've been focusing on things like EGP and so on. But the notion here is, what would be the characteristics of good governance, right? It's not so much that we're talking about marketplace processes, but we're actually talking about how do we make choices at scale? How do we have enough wisdom individually and collectively that the choices made with respect to high criticality things like, pollution or existential risk or, social process, like how do we make choices that don't destabilize into power games, essentially transactional games that are going to result in an even higher Gini coefficient, which is the degree of inequality. It's a math term for how much inequality there is in a system. It's just a general way of calculating that. Anyways, so in effect, what we're looking at is something that has an evening temper and stays that way. And in effect, that means that we have to account for the forces that are in the system. So what would something like that look like? Well, I noticed, for example, that the three ways in which modern economies operate is to extract resources, to take a tree out of nature, then you dragged it into a woodlot. So that's extraction. It's no longer in the context it was. It's now in the new context and it's dead. So the level of complexity of the system has just gone down by, roughly 16 orders of magnitude, probably more, right? And then you take that and you saw it up into lumber and you build furniture out of it and then you sell the furniture. So now you've taken a physical embodied item and you've turned it into a abstract number, so many dollars or yen or whatever, right? So you've extracted and now you've abstracted. You've taken it out of the embodied and into the abstract. And then you do the accumulation move. You take that money, you deposit it in a bank somewhere or another, or you put it in a vault or something like that. And whatever happens is that it just gets summed up with all of the rest of the transactions you did that month, for example. And so the amount of information needed to describe the thing in the woods, it's something like 10 to the 33, order complexity. When it's in the log state, it's probably about 10 to the 16 order complexity. When you saw it up into furniture and you turn it into a number, you can represent that with a 16-bit or 32-bit floating point number. Okay. That's basically 1 unit of complexity, or, 16 out of, what it used to be 10 to the 16. Okay. So you've lost 16 orders of magnitude of complexity-ish. And then you sum it into a bank account. So it's not even a whole unit anymore. It's a tiny fraction unit of information. Okay. So in effect, the extraction, abstraction, accumulation curve is everywhere happening. And as you notice, it's a linear process. As much as everything is associated with causation is pretty much a linear process. But when you look at nature, it's circular process. That's how you create sustainability. That's how you convert a finite game into an infinite game. So what you end up doing then is you say, okay, well, if we're going to, in a sense, restore the cycle, we have to reverse the three things. We have to create complementary process. So complementary to accumulation, you do distribution. And complementary to abstraction, you do embodiment. And complementary to extraction, you do recontextualization. And when you have figured out a way to take money in the bank and turn it into something which is relevant to an ecosystem, you've done this. You've basically moved it from accumulated to distributed to embodied, and embodied into context. And so in effect, there's a sense here in which the kinds of skills that we have as a species, having focused entirely on the monetary and power-based side of things, like if you want to do the distribution, embodiment, and recontextualization thing, the basis upon which you're going to do that is the skill of care. Can you care in a way that doesn't become naive and co-opted by other people who haven't yet figured out how to care and are still doing the extraction, abstraction, accumulation move, right? So in effect, a solution here, something other than capitalism, is going to need to implement this process. It's going to somehow need to be good at making choices in a way that is distributed, making choices in a way that's embodied, and making choices in a way that's recontextualized. And so again, when we're thinking about energy dynamics, or in this particular sense, if we're going to upgrade from finite games to infinite games and from infinite games to design, the way in which we're going to do that is essentially going to be fundamentally a choice-making process that moves us in a way that it's not just one person making choices. Choices are distributed, right? So it's like an EGP dynamic. It's embodied, which means that we in effect have to be in person with one another, or otherwise, you can do some of it online, but honestly, it's like human beings know how to communicate with one another. They know how to attune to one another. It's built into our biology. We need to, in a sense, move it out of our head and into our hearts in order for care to become a genuine skill. And you need your heart. You need to have all of yourself in the process. And so in effect, there's a sense in which you are connecting head, heart, and gut, basically. And as a whole being, you are now acting in the world. That's what effectiveness is. That's what mastery is. And you're doing so in a way that is sensitive to the surroundings, to the environment, to the situation that is local. And, in this particular sense, that skillfulness of holding choice at scale with an adequate level of wisdom to be responsive to things like existential risk or ecology or to civilization design or any of the other big, hairy, audacious problems, such as inequality and pollution and all the rest, that this level of skillfulness in terms of how we hold care in these specific ways is mandatory. Nature sets a threshold of the level of skillfulness you must have in order to survive. And if we're going to pass the Fermi paradox condition of becoming a future species that has any degree of civility associated with it all, like if civilization is depending upon city and civility, then we're going to need to figure out how to actually attune and care for one another. We're going to need to, in a sense, implement the cycle of human process, like actually, which has to do with, think about a baby. A baby is born, the mother attaches to the baby, and then through that attunement, is the baby hungry? Does it need to sleep? Is it wet? I mean, is it cold? You have to develop some attunement because it can't tell you anything. And then through that, you can implement nurturing care action. And without attachment, attunement, nurturing care action, the child never grows up. And growing up would be, it develops trust. It develops to some extent autonomy. And eventually it grows up enough that it can start its own family. And if you don't get those things to happen, if you don't have that process actually go all the way through, families are over, civilization is over, game's over. So in this sense, we're saying, okay, we need to basically get the whole sustainability piece right. We need to get the evolution piece right. And we need to get the consciousness piece right. Because the choice making, the care, it's going to be through consciousness. It's not going to be through some automated system. It's not going to be something we outsource to some AI, because AI can't do that. Okay. You can't bring your body into contact with an AI and produce a child. It just doesn't work that way. So in effect, there's a sense here in which if you're going to produce a child that actually has the capacity to live in the world, it needs to know how to do things like attach, attune, nurturing care action, to develop interpersonal trust, a certain degree of autonomy, become an adult, and effectively be skillful in raising children, i.e. doing the same thing all over again. And unless you get that minimum cycle right, it doesn't happen. So in this sense, we're therefore saying, okay, we really want to pay attention to the dynamics of care, the dynamics of choice, how we distribute choice, how we hold choice collectively, in such a way that it increases our level of wisdom in our embodiment in a way that is relevant, actually relevant to the situation we're in right now. Not as we think it's going to be 100 years from now or 1,000 years from now and so on and so forth. We can account for that, much as we can learn from history, can learn from what happened in the last 1,000 years, right? You need to, wisdom is expanding your field of the basis from which you make your choice in time, across space, and across possibility. You want to account for, through your experience, you've learned all the different ways things can happen. So you have a wider range of possibility that you're aware of. You have a wider range of time that you're aware of, and you have a wider range of space that you're aware of. And when you integrate all that, you can make a wiser choice, a more relevant, embodied, contextualized choice. We need to figure out ways to do this collectively that is adequate to the situation we're currently in. And right now, we haven't even begun to develop those skills. We still think naively that it can all be done with computers and causation process and technology. And it just isn't true. If it was true, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So in this sense, there's a notion here where we're basically getting back to the sort of root analysis. I don't even want to say root causes, but if causation is the thing that got us into this particular mess, causation is not the thing that's going to get us out. We're going to need something else. We're going to need choice. And so in effect, the whole notion of how we hold choice and how we hold value and how we hold virtue being that we are a fit container for holding good choices, good community, good process that creates collective wisdom. These are the kinds of things that effectively we want to now learn about and develop skills about, and to get to the point that we have sophisticated approaches to how we collectively make choices. And that's the cutting edge. That is the future. No question about it. Like, I know there's a lot of people who think artificial intelligence is the future. It's a distraction. It doesn't matter. Right? So in effect, there's a thing here where, I'm basically a little bit going against the current here by basically saying, yeah, I can see that artificial intelligence is useful for a lot of automation stuff. It's useful for a lot of mechanical stuff, pushing atoms around. But if you want to make better choices, you're going to need to think at a deeper level. And that's where we're at.
Yeah. So one of the tensions here is between the future and where we are now and something like a transition, where I just want to name one aspect of a transition, which is coming up in what you're sharing, which comes through when you say, well, be careful about people who might be playing the accumulation, extraction, abstraction game, because that could be profoundly detrimental to opening up processes of care with others. And there's partly the massive asymmetries in power that already exist. People feel trapped in those worlds, maybe don't have the vision to see otherwise, and partly the game seems to aim at reducing people's capacity to be able to see otherwise. So there's tremendous forces of causation being applied, and I think intentionally as well as unintentionally. And that's where as well I feel it's relevant to bring this in.
Well, there is politics. I'm not disclaiming that. And I agree with what you're saying. Like there's a situation where a lot of people feel like they're entangled in the current game. And so, one thing that we can sort of bring to mindfulness is when you say that you're free, does that mean that you're free to play the game the way you want to, or does that mean you're free to walk away from the game altogether? And the way to ask this is, can you walk away from the economic system? Are you allowed to live independently of participating in the transactional process of the ambient culture that you're a part of? Are you allowed to live in a way that is not entangled with the power structures of the world that you're in? And I would think for pretty much everybody in the entire world, the answer is probably no, right? We say that we're free, but it's basically like, you're walking into a car dealership and the car, the salesperson says, do you want the red one or the blue one? Well, I don't want to buy a car because the prices are terrible. I want to turn around, walk out the door and go to the dealership across the street. Or maybe their prices are terrible too. Maybe I'll wait until next month to buy a car. Or maybe I decide that I want a bike instead. There's a sense in which the choice about which game to play is at least as much a requirement of freedom as the choice of how to play within a particular game. And so you're right. A lot of people are feeling tremendously trapped. And so in this particular sense, the first motion, the first transition is basically to start to work on increasing the flexibility of the imagination. What would a solution look like? What would it feel like? What would a different non-game answer even be? Right? Like at this particular point, we're so steeped in the idea of only game methods could work that it's actually quite difficult for anybody to imagine what a non-game relationship would look like. You have to remind them. You have to basically say, well, when you were born, were you in a gaming relationship with your mother? No, not really. She took care of you because she cared, not because she had to. I mean, to a certain extent, there was a certain social obligation, perhaps, but honestly, I think that would be the least important thing. It's like she wanted a child. She had a child. So in effect, there's a sense in which there's a kind of underlying dynamic here that is so implicit, so implied and driven so far beneath the surface that it is genuinely challenging to see the water that we're swimming in and to imagine what air would feel like. To imagine what coming out of the ocean and getting onto dry land, what it would be to work in the world with legs rather than with fins. And that's the scope of what we're talking about. I mean, it's literally nothing less than as fundamental a transition as any other primary stage of evolution has ever been. But that's what's required. There's nothing for it. We have to go through this. So yeah, in one sense, it would be like, okay, well, how do I help common people? Well, to some extent, you might want to decide to think about moving value out of the virtual and keeping it in the embodied. Like let's look at several really practical things that we can notice. If you're in a small town somewhere or another and a big box store moves in, any money you pay to that big box store leaves the scene. That basically means that the town itself becomes poorer every time you basically buy something from some foreigner versus from somebody local. So in this particular sense, I can see that there's some real benefit to say, well, we should basically promote small shops. We should promote local businesses. We should promote these kinds of things. Obviously, the forces that are in the system are way stronger than that because the big box store is way better game player than your local mom and pop, whatever, right? And but the thing is that at some point or another, we have to get back down to the values and the virtues. Like, how are we as individuals being mindful of the dynamics that are going on here? Do we have the willingness to develop the imagination necessary to see what a healthy town or a healthy community would even feel like or look like? And have we consistently learned to do the things we need to do? In other words, we need to move away from being the adolescent to being the adult. Right now, the whole world, the entire marketing thing is driven by adolescent mores. But as you mentioned, there's an even deeper layer underneath this. Let's look at it from the point of view of, say, maker versus taker. Have I introduced this to you yet? Okay. Maker community makes stuff. Taker community takes stuff. It's very obvious, right? Okay. Up until around 2008 or so, prior to the sort of financial crash, I'm going to speak pretty locally in the United States here, but I suspect other things similar to this have happened elsewhere in the world, where the people that essentially played the game of the marketplace and lost, they did this too big to fail thing. And now essentially the people that did the worst stuff got the most benefit. They got bailed out. And so in effect, the values shifted. It used to be under the surface that those who had figured out how to con the most people had effectively take the most stuff were considered high value, but only in the upper echelons of the elite and kind of in secret. But after that, the notion of being generous and giving and so on and so forth became, oh, you're just naive. You're not actually skillful. You're not actually effective. The real skillful people are the ones that have figured out how to con the U.S. government, or to con the entire financial system, or to con everybody else in the sector and come out ahead. In other words, to win the game, even illegitimately. Okay. So the value system shifted. When we look at the sort of libertarian left, at first it was promoting the sense of we all give, and as a result, the commons becomes a greater place. But then it shifted into this sort of thing of victimization, and we're going to basically figure out as a victim how we can claim more of the commons, right? So if you look at it from a flows point of view, if the value system is such that the highest value person is the one that can take the most, and nobody wants to contribute to the commons, because to contribute to the commons is effectively to be labeled a sucker. And the value is the sort of virtue is to be the best con artist, to be the least naive, and to take the most value. That your value, in effect, your social value, the notion that you have prestige or status, is going to be associated with how skillful you are as a taker, right? The CEO image became kind of the thing, because the CEO, of course, came away with the big bucks, right? And, the whole notion of FU money, I don't know whether this is something where I can swear or not. It's your podcast, so you have to tell me if I'm allowed.
Well, interestingly, YouTube has made it so that if you don't, I never censor any words, but if you don't censor certain swear words, then you get downranked. So
okay,
I'll leave it in your court.
I'm going to try to not censor you, so I get you censored anyway. So in effect, there's a notion here where the idea of the American dream was to develop independence. To have enough monetary resources, you didn't need to depend on anybody else. You could be sovereign to some extent. And if you somehow manage to achieve this notion of perfect independence, I don't need to depend on anybody, then you've now maxed out your capacity to not have to deal with your collective action abuse trauma, right? The trauma of being abused by institutions, by large groups of people, by collectives of one sort or another, including the government, right? Let alone the church or anything else, whatever cult you might happen to have gotten signed up in, and so on. So in effect, there's a sense here where our entire desire for individualism, you might remember, comes out of a strong trauma reaction for most of the United States, right? And that in effect, this whole tendency to try to basically be independent from community is because community has been so unhealthy for so long that we've, in a sense, enshrined this notion of taker mentality. But previously to 2008, the at least objective status was associated with people who could produce the most resource. So we happen to both be men in this conversation, and we are in the lowest status. It's the status hierarchy is inverted at this point. So at this particular point, as white men, we're not allowed to have an opinion. But the reality is that we have this situation that if we basically just look at this sort of history of, okay, well, you guys were the takers. Now you're not supposed to take anymore. You're supposed to give back, and so on and so forth. It's kind of like, well, actually, as a guy, I kind of consider that the only way I can think of myself as successful is if I produce more value than I just need myself. Like if I just was effective enough in life to feed myself, I can't start a family. So in effect, it's kind of like I need to be more productive than just my own needs. I need to basically produce for a partner and for the children and whatever else, right? There's a sense in which unless we think of ourselves as hyper productive beyond just ourselves, we haven't been successful as men, basically, right? And so, and this is not just an opinion, it's just kind of the reality of what it meant to be a family. Was like somebody's got to basically, provide for the children, to protect the family. And so in a certain sense, I have to be hyper skillful beyond just being able to protect myself or to provide resources for myself. So this notion of giver mentality or maker mentality was essentially fundamental to civilization. But when you end up with this situation where now the highest status isn't the person that makes the most value, but the person that takes the most value, i.e. the person that is deserving the most. And we all know that, in this particular sense, we're looking at just written large, the three largest. Can you name for me, just as a puzzle here, what are the three largest transactions in all of time?
In one go.
Yeah, this is actually a very hard question until you hear the answer, at which point it becomes, of course it is. Like,
right,
what
okay.
are the three largest categories of value flow?
Right, so that could include how we've treated the natural world. We're not talking about who purchased what for what. Okay, yeah.
Right, so the flow of from nature to humanity is the largest value flow. Okay, that's basically all economic value somewhere or another came out of nature.
Right.
So that's the largest.
We've also
the next largest.
Are we distinguishing humanity from nature here? So we're the labor value and the extraction of.
Yeah, we've in effect extracted a huge amount of value from nature and made it into human beings, which then make more human beings. But at this point, the net transfer from nature to human beings is the largest value transfer. The next largest value transfer
would be then from humanity to technology.
Haven't gotten to that yet. From the past to the future, from people previous generations to people in subsequent generations. Why? Because the people in previous generations can't keep it. Right? So all of the value that the people in all of the previous generations have received from nature is paid forward into their children because it has to be. Okay? What is the third largest category of value flow?
Would it be from the future?
Nope. From men to women. Across all of time, right? So in this particular sense, again, just speaking fundamentally from a biological perspective, all of the production essentially from a physics taking from nature, moving it into the future, like that's something that effectively is a maker side of things, right? And then of course the women will take those values and they'll turn it into biology and a child pops out, right? So in effect, there's a sense here in which, again, not talking about the modern world where all of this gets turned around, but for, up until roughly a few hundred years ago, right? Most of the economic value was produced by men. And of course, there's exceptions and you can go back and look at all sorts of exceptions, but the bulk, what I'm talking about is the bulk transfer. Okay. So in this particular sense, we're saying, okay, well, if we move from a societal orientation, which is moving from the most deserving are the people that essentially make value to the most deserving are the people that take value, then at some point or another, the balance of the relationship with the commons is going to change. So if I basically think about all of the people who are essentially contributing to the commons versus all the people that are taking from the commons, if the fundamental social premise is that you are a higher status individual if you take from the commons, whatever the commons is, than if you give to the commons. It used to be that the givers to the commons were the higher status, at least nominally. But then once 2008 happened, and then you basically said, actually, the highest status people are the people that take from the commons, and that percolates down to every level of society, from not just the multinational corporations, but down to the level of individuals. Then the notion of contributing to the commons is now something that effectively is treated as a bad idea. And this, of course, is wrong because what happens is that at some point the commons goes away and nobody has that anymore. That is called the tragedy of the commons. And this is a common philosophical thing. We've all heard of it, right? So in this particular sense, if you're saying what is a practical thing that we can do, we could start to say at a cultural level, at a cultural ecology level even, we need to, in a sense, start valuing the producers of value, that the virtue wants to be reassociated with the creation of prosperity rather than with the consumption of prosperity, with the production rather than the notion of deservingness. I don't understand deservingness. Honestly, it just doesn't make sense to me as a concept. The idea that any person intrinsically is deserving of anything is a little weird. Like I can say, yeah, every child deserves some notion of dignity, safety, and belongingness. But frankly, there's lots of children in the world that don't get any of those, or maybe get one or two and not the third, right? There's so many situations in the world where children, which you would think would have a kind of inherent deservingness, still don't get that. Like, if you grow up with an alcoholic, abusive, or, narcissistic, or just psychosis or whatever, there's all sorts of ways in which your parental units could effectively be disabling of you. So in this particular sense, rather than going into the victim mentality of, well, I deserve more, you want to basically shift into the sense of, how do I create more and have that creation go into the commons in a way that doesn't necessarily just get stolen by some other person that is naively or falsely thinking that they deserve what I created. So in this particular sense, that's the transition. And you see a lot of people at this point basically saying, yeah, I don't want to contribute to the commons. I don't want to pay taxes. I don't want to basically build lots and lots of value because frankly, she'll divorce me and take all the children and all the resources anyways. There's no legal protections for any of this. So in effect, there's a scenario here where to produce value at this particular point is not only low status, low intelligence, but it's basically something at this point that's just considered to be fundamentally disadvantageous. We have to change the social mores around that, right? The notion of shame wants to be associated with someone who takes rather than with someone who makes. But right now, all the shame is being heaped on the makers and not at all on the takers. The takers are being celebrated and the makers are basically being shamed out of existence. And of course, the inevitable result of that is that the commons dries up and then civilization comes to an end, because civilization is a commons. It's the commons that we call cities, and it's the commons we call civility. But when civility itself gets weaponized, then, basically at that point, all bets are off. It's going to go from, like, civility would have been a way to have prevented a hot war, like people actually shooting one another. But when civility is no longer available, when civility itself is being weaponized, then the inevitable consequences is that sometime shortly after that, the level of violence starts climbing, right? Because if every single time people are trying to have an intellectual argument to talk about ideas, and other people will basically pull it into an emotional sphere, make it an emotional argument, and you're therefore wrong for thinking rationally. The rationalism itself is treated as the enemy, partially because it's associated with causation. As we noticed earlier, causation can't solve this problem. But you won't solve the problem of make or better choices by doing it from an emotional basis. You'll make better choices by having emotional intelligence, which means that there's some rationalness to that as well. You want to combine rational with emotional feeling awareness. You want to have both. You don't want to have just one or the other. But every single time people basically stomp a rational conversation with irrational emotional abuse and manipulation, then at some point or another, reality is going to set in, and people will basically be forced in a position where they have to stop emotional immaturity with physical process. Even if they don't do it personally, nature will do it, right? At some point or another, nature isn't going to care how entitled you think you are. It's going to basically not care that you can't feed yourself because you don't have any money, because effectively you made yourself into a position where it's impossible to earn it because you've made it so that the entire economy blew up, right? Like, I think at some point or another, we have to basically start to move it out of a conversation as who has what and who's deserving and so on and so forth, and start to think about it at a deeper level of the relationship between choice, change, and causation, of the sort of dynamics that inform how do we make better choices, rather than continually trying to use causal processes to compel other people to give you stuff because you believe that you deserved it, right? That you're the victim, so therefore you deserve X, Y, and Z restitution and so on and so forth. You're basically trying to use legal tools and conversational manipulation and all the rest of that sort of stuff to become a better taker. And all you're really doing is depleting the commons more and more. And you then do it with technology. You then do it with artificial intelligence, and you then become justified. Well, my AI told me that I was right and that I was a victim and that I was deserving of X, Y, and Z. Nature doesn't care. Other human beings might care, but you have to basically be in relationship with them where that relationship's compassionate enough so the care becomes possible. But if the notion of compassion itself has been weaponized to such an extent, then then even care itself doesn't become something that's available as part of the conversation. So at this point, I would say, if we're looking to try to move into the space of solutions, first of all, we need to learn how to talk to one another. We need to learn how to be civil. We need to learn how to effectively be emotionally intelligent and rational at the same time. Wow, what an idea. And then on the other hand, we need to start thinking deeper about the relationship between value production and value consumption, and to actually socially favor the value production and have a way for that to occur in a way that doesn't automatically castrate the person that's producing the value production. Okay. That would be a good idea. Yeah. And then, from there, we could start to think about things like choice distribution and embodiment and contextualization so that we can actually begin to reverse these kinds of things to actually make something that works in the world. So I think of this as a social problem, not a financial one.
Yeah. So one of the core things I'm hearing, certainly that I would emphasize, is the importance of receptivity to relationship and to be able to perceive what is vital and what is contributing vitality to relationship.
Yeah, compassion, care, connection, attunement, discernment, and from that, wisdom, collective wisdom.
Right. And, so one of the things I notice is the blocks one might experience to entering the kind of relational process that you're pointing at, particularly when you emphasize both the thinking and the feeling, or the emotion and the rationality, that the blocks can show up quite differently depending on what you might be approaching with, and what you might meet in the other. And so that's one of the challenging things, which is why I'm emphasizing the receptivity in relationship as something which can, it is
humility itself.
Right. Exactly.
So that virtue of humility as a kind of willingness to perceive from the other's perspective so that we can see both ourselves and the other and the situation more legitimately. So one of the things that we would love to see more of is just the virtue of humility being treated as a virtue rather than as, say, oh, well, that person is humble, so therefore he's less desirable for relationship than the, 6-foot Chad that's sitting next to him.
And for it not to be performative, which is the other point you're making. And so with that in mind, one of the things I've mentioned a few times on the podcast before, that the etymology of humility is to do with the roots, and being low to the earth, to do with the roots. And that brings in, if we go below the earth, there's the unseen connectivity and exchange processes, whether between mycelial and trees, which are doing a whole lot of work to make possible the basis of vitality, from which one is in a sense anchoring to do a non-performative humility. But it's also a very complex context. And so there is a sense in which the humility being pointed to here is one that is able to locate itself with respect to what matters, in a way where what matters cannot just be reduced to some notion or concept of compassion, but also involves some of the dynamics of the broader, maybe deeper flows.
It's got to touch the real, like the metaphor of the roots is delightful, right? Because if you're in touch with the ground, like it used to be a long time ago, we're talking like ancient times, that the notion of the snake, or in this particular case, the dragon, was considered a symbol of wisdom because its entire body was touching the ground. It knew the truth in the sense of ground truth, like that which is inarguable, not an element of belief, but genuinely in contact with the surface of the world, the reality of the world. And when you're looking at the deep unconscious communications, in a sense, humility is recognizing that we are as much an unconscious as we are a conscious. We are as much embodied as we are a brain. And that unless we integrate and accept and actually be in right relationship to our own genuine nature, we can't be in relationship with one another, right? Like the tree has to be the tree in order for its roots to mesh with other trees. We have to be human in order to mesh with other human beings. And that means a certain degree of humility for that relationship to thrive on the basis of this unconscious network of ideas and experiences, like the mere fact that we eat the same foods. Roughly speaking, every mammal and creature on Earth is going to integrate carbon-based foods, okay, one form or another. And that gives us a metabolism that helps us to have compassion and understand one another because we all live the same way. And so, in this sense, to try to look for compassion from a machine which doesn't even have a common digestive system with us is a complete farce. So we need to relearn how to be human beings so we can be human together, renaturalize ourselves, and ultimately rewild ourselves so that we can be in right balance with nature so that endurance does happen. Sustainability, evolution, and consciousness can all co-occur. The humility is the consciousness piece.
Yeah. So one piece I want to add in here is, on the one hand, to recognize the way that you've articulated embodiment as actually being in person, being in a rich enough embodied context so that such things like attunement are more possible. At least there's a sense in which that's obviously true. My relating to it is to also wants to emphasize the orientation. So if we say that virtualization is on the other end of embodiment, then there's a sense in which I might meet you as we are here, where there is a context of the virtual, but we can co-orient and coordinate in relation with the virtual, and then have a sense of where we may ground ourselves and are grounded with respect to the embodied. And when I think about everything from philosophy as well as to the complexity of the systems of power and transaction, which are so incredibly powerful at ensnaring and entangling us, of course, a lot of that is experienced in a virtual way. And so the prospect of rewilding and the prospect of attaining, in some sense, the ideal of the direction, of course, does feel very far away. And it could be as simple in one sense, if one is so fortunate as to step outside and be able to touch grass and all of that, we can do both sides of it. But there's also still this necessity, it seems, of being able to meet and interact in the context of where we are, which in its own way might be tremendously virtualized. And, not to decry that in a sense as a failure or a task not to be taken on, but what humility can we bring to that? And in what way can we reorient from that basis? And here is where, notions of a certain kind of sacrifice is something that's worth opening up. There's this sense, so for instance, one of the ways you've communicated what I'm roughly speaking pointing towards here is, there's a sense of the beauty and the service of planting a tree for which you may not get to sit in the shade. Right. So there's that element, but there's also, I think, something to affirm about the actual vitality associated with that planting of the tree and nurturing it from sapling form.
The ground wants to be a ground that can receive the seed. So in other words, I can't just plant a tree in the middle of a parking lot. The other thing that becomes important is that as the person planting the tree, I'm wanting to look ahead. Is this a community that will value the tree for being a tree? Or is this a community that might basically say, oh, as soon as that thing's tall enough to make lumber, I'm cutting it so that I can basically. So for me, if I'm planting the tree, knowing that all I'm really doing is making the second son of that guy down the road a little richer because he basically got some lumber out of my effort, and I'm basically going to say, this ain't the ground. I want to go elsewhere that is also fertile ground and has a community that would value it. Or if this is the only ground in which this seed can take, I don't want the seed to die. I'm going to basically, try to preserve that tree, but I'm also going to try to set up something, maybe culturally. Legally, I have doubts that that'll work. But for example, if I basically somehow manage to convince the community that actually this is a tree that you want to let live, then I'm going to feel good about making the sacrifice. But this is where the naivete comes in. It used to be the case that the notion of turn the other cheek and sacrifice was treated as a virtue. Notice how closely aligned the notion of virtual and virtue is. Virtual is empty.
I've done some writing on this.
Yeah, great. Well, then I'd love to see it. Whereas virtue is indwelling. It's like virtual is abstracted from the outside, but virtue is deep indwelling on the inside. And so in this particular sense, I want to have both the virtue of being a maker, being a creator, being somebody that produces value beyond my own needs, beyond my own self, to be super generative. And I want to be mindful that the generativity is going where it's going to actually do some good. So in effect, I need the wisdom in addition to the willingness. And in effect, the combination, it's always been the case. Like rich people will basically say to all the factory workers, do the sacrifice. And then they will try to ensure that the people are going through a schooling system that effectively is based on the Prussian model of making you obedient slaves, and therefore turn you into really good workers that don't think about where does all the value, where does all the benefit go? Well, it obviously goes to the rich person who basically flounders it on some rich yacht that basically is going to sink because they didn't pay attention to the local climate or something, right? And so there's a point here where it can't just be sacrificial willingness. It has to be mindfulness to really understand what is going to be generative, not just today, but tomorrow. What is going to, in a sense, be a contribution to the commons that isn't just going to be stolen by somebody who's essentially increasing their prestige. And that's how relationships break with me. Like if I notice that your intentions, no matter what you say, but your actual actions are just to increase your own aggrandizement, your own status, and doesn't actually contribute anything to the world, then I'm basically going to say, well, you're talking about, not to you personally, Tim, but I basically have been in relationships, you know the story already, where people extracted value from the commons. I had given value to the commons, and then I watched them steal it. And it would be like, you know what? First, I'm going to block you from stealing it, but then I'm also going to think carefully about whether or not I give to that commons. So in effect, I've gotten very reluctant to basically be too contributive if it's just going to go to waste anyways.
Yeah, there was a way I wrote poetically once about the fate of that mode of sacrifice in terms of being forlorn and abandoned.
Uh-huh.
So
there's devotion, but devotion wants to be to that which is worthy to be devoted to. And humility is, in a sense, a willingness to say, I might not necessarily be the most virtue-produced thing in the world, but I'm willing to work on becoming virtuous. I'm willing to become a fit container for the work that I do. And if I'm going to give to somebody, I would want them to be a fit container as well. I'd want them to have some humility as well. And under those circumstances, now we're in a situation where the commons, the community becomes something which is generative. It's growing, it's building. But I have to work at the social level first. We all need to work on the virtue side of things. And the use of shaming is roughly the same thing as the use of guns. You can't shame people who shame people because shaming people is wrong. Right? You kill people who kill people because that killing people is wrong. Okay. That whole thing is kind of messed up. So, and it's basically the case that right now there is so much unconsciousness about social process, around human process, around what virtue is. And we've got it all backwards. So that ends up happening is that we're cutting our own feet off. And this is a place where we need to become super aware so that our super generativity can actually work.
Yeah, there's it reminds me of a line of logic that Girard has when he describes violence and the way that violence, the reason why people are animated to respond violently in kind is because of the abhorrence of violence. So it's interesting how we can be caught in these self-destructive, self-annihilating patterns, and it can seem so obvious a mistake to make. And with respect to the mediation of violence, of course, we are very much still in process. So there's a couple things here, Forrest. I want to ask you something which I know you, well, sometimes you surprise me by all of a sudden giving a 10-second answer, but usually it's a significantly longer answer. And so I do want to ask you one of those questions which can hopefully give, tie a few things together with respect to the initial framing of our conversation. Before I do that, just as a personal reflection of one other way of seeing that seems to be in connection with what you're saying. I know that one of the things you will articulate is a sort of orientation towards life lived well and fully. Mm-hmm. And one of the ways that I've been thinking about that in relation to other notions for some time, you have notions of libido and motido, and those have lots of connotations, but there's a sense in which there is a certain value in the orientation toward death in terms of giving everything, giving fully, and then, but but to have them both in relation, you wants to something that's actually in service to that of virtue, and so the well aspect of there being connoted. And so, one of the ways I sometimes give an example of that is just in the context of playing football, and how different players can show up on the team in that context. And, because you can always give everything, right? And then some players have got more quality, but you obviously want to have the balance anyway. Given what we've discussed, beginning from a conversation about money and then power, understood a lot in terms of causation, I want to ask why. The answer is sort of contained in what you've already said, but I want to give the opportunity to bring it out more explicitly. Why are dominant elements in the collective so drawn towards artificial intelligence, turning so much of the world's energy possibility into artificial intelligence, that in a sense, money and power, more than most other things, maybe buying up the land, right? Right, buying up the land. But apart from that, being put in towards artificial intelligence. So why, first of all, is that happening? Maybe seems obvious, but why is that happening, and what else could it be put towards? What ought it be put towards?
Okay. So, the Gibb first answer that is usually given in regards to why artificial intelligence has so much financial backing, like there's so much investment into that. Most venture capitalists and people who are companies, for example, that were very successful, like Microsoft or the others, they accumulated large amounts of money. They had war chests that they could use to invest in all sorts of things. And obviously, they're going to want to invest it in a way that would provide more money in the future. So it's basically like we've collected the capacity to make all these choices, but we don't know what to choose today. We do know that we want to choose things that's going to increase our ability to choose tomorrow. That's a summary of whatever capital I have today, whatever savings I have today, I want to invest it so that I at least preserve the value that I have, or if anything, I increase the share of the choices that I can make in the world relative to everybody else. So again, you notice I'm using the same sort of simplifications I was using earlier. The thing about artificial intelligence is that it's not just a machine that can automate particular things. It's an ability to outsource choices, like basic choices. So say I was a manufacturer. I basically had a manufacturing company for a while. I was a CEO. So I've been through this. I've seen it from the inside. The main thing that is the case is that when I hire somebody, I'm aware of the fact that I can't make all the choices that need to be made. Like picking up this thing and attaching it to that thing and putting it in a box and putting a label on it. Those are choices to move and to do the thing versus to do something else. And the sheer number of things that need to be chosen in a given scenario is huge, way beyond the capacity of any one person to do in the 24-hour time period. So when I hire somebody, I'm basically giving them money, which is a capacity for them to make choices in their lives, with the agreement, right? That's the employment contract, that they will choose in a way that's in alignment with what I want. So in other words, I can make a general choice and then they can make all the specific choices. And in return for this, I'm enabling them to make choices in other places to purchase goods or services that they themselves wouldn't have been able to choose except for virtue of the fact that some other producer carved up the vegetables and another person chose to drive them from point A to point B so that they could buy them at the supermarket, right? So in effect, there's a notion here that employment is a phenomenology of choice, fundamentally. If I'm the employee, I'm choosing to align my choices with this organization for 8 hours a day so that in the subsequent 4 hours of that same day, I might be able to go to a bar because that's what I choose to do, right? And there's a scenario here where we're really talking about choices as basically the exchange that's going on in any employment process. So I wanted to do that simplification. Now we have artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence becomes a way of essentially making the same bargain, but at a much better rate. Like, this computer isn't just going to do it for 8 hours. It's going to do it for 24 hours. And the cost of electricity is way less than the cost of employing that person, right? Like to employ that person, I have to pay workers' comp. I have to pay medical insurance. I've got to pay employment taxes. I've got to file all this paperwork with the state. I have to have an entire team of people, usually called human resources, which is itself an abomination. But there's a phenomenology here where I can effectively get the same sort of contract. I can essentially say, I'm going to invest a certain amount of energy, a certain amount of choice-making capacity into this device. And in return, it'll basically make a bunch of choices on my behalf. Well, they're not actually choices. It's just the causal output of an algorithm. But from the point of view of what I'm looking about, again, most people are going to say that choice and causation, well, we have the quote unquote illusion of free will. Really technical aside, free will is an illusion, but choice is real. And it's just one of those things that this is a language thing that a philosopher would care about, but most ordinary people wouldn't. But anyways, the point here is that the underlying phenomenology of a corporation is a kind of system. It's a kind of machine. So the fine distinction between true choice versus the causal simulation of choice may as well not matter in this scenario. So in this particular case, the motivation for why to invest in machines that automates things is because they increase the degree to which you can have earnings. So if I manage to fire all my staff and replace them with computers, that basically means that the cost of production has gone down by a factor of 9 or 10 or so. Like I'm basically spending 1/10 of what I otherwise would have, and I'm getting 3 times as much productivity at least, probably 4, right? So, and then you think about the network effects. If I'm an AI company that's made these capacities, made these machinery, then selling the machinery to all of these businesses, all of these factories or corporations or whatever it is that's being replaced by AI, that becomes a 10x, 100x, 1,000x, maybe even 10,000x return on investment, right? And so from a venture capital point of view, venture capital is a very asymmetric game. As a venture capitalist, I might invest in 15 things, and 14 of them may be total losses. But if that 15 one is a 100x yield on investment, it pays for those 14 and I get more. Now, I'm not personally a venture capitalist. I just happen to know about venture capitalism a little bit, right? Again, because I was in the industry for a while and I've left the scene basically. But the point is that a venture capitalist that can basically get more than 100x return on investment, that's the golden ticket. They're done. They've won. Okay. But this AI thing, this is a thing where they're basically saying, wow, I could probably get 1,000x return on investment, or maybe 10,000 return on investment. This is the best game anybody has ever played. So you have this sort of perfect storm of technology coming in and people with huge war chests of money to invest in something, and investing it in almost anything else doesn't even seem to make sense in comparison. Like, you're going to put it in Bitcoin? Well, that's kind of risky. Well, you're going to put it in government bonds? Well, that's also kind of risky. Maybe. It depends. A lot of stuff can happen. But if I make the capacity to make lots of money, well, that's like that exponential thing, exponent again, right? That's like first time ever. Of course, they're going to do all they can. It's like, this is it's like if they're gambling, it's like double or nothing at the very end of the night. So there's a scenario here where, just from a financial perspective, there is huge return on investment ideas, hype going on, and anything having to do with long-term existential risk never even entered their minds. So, or if it did, it became yet another thing. Wow, this thing is so powerful. It's so dangerous. Therefore, we should regulate it. So therefore, we are the only ones that can even play this game. So as far as they're concerned, the existential risk thing is just a sales pitch that allows them to multiply the degree of worthiness of investing in this. Like if you were the first person to invest in nuclear technology with the hope of actually being able to build weapons, and then those weapons essentially became the most valuable thing you could purchase if you were a government, right? Then now all of a sudden you're making bank. So this is the basic reason why artificial intelligence is basically being treated with such hype right now. But the other piece, and this is, I think, kind of the deeper reason, is that, again, there's a profound confusion between causal process and choice process. And so if people look at governments and things like that, and they say, well, humanity's fucked it up pretty bad, like we're noticing all these particular problems. Maybe we're just bad at making choices. So we're going to abdicate that. We're going to give all of our choices to machines, because machines are probably more trustworthy than your politicians that are in the White House. Okay. Like between trusting an automated system versus trusting a bureaucrat who is for sure on the graft, you're going to trust the machine. At least it follows rules, right? Like the guy, he ain't going to follow rules. He's just going to basically do whatever the fuck he wants that day. I'm sorry. Just going to cut that one word out. Anyways, the point here is that there's a whole phenomenology associated with us discounting our own capacity to make choices collectively in a way that actually works. And so in effect, the common people are basically saying, well, at least it's better than what's currently going on. Maybe that'll turn out all right in the long run. Now, of course, that turns out to be not true, because it just increases the level of inequality even more, because the average person isn't going to understand how to build an LLM from scratch. They're not going to have the resources to do that. The whole Trojan horse kind of thing has gotten way worse. The Manchurian candidate scenario has gotten way worse. At this particular point, you can't trust half of the stuff you see on the media anyways now, because it's already propaganda most of the time. So in effect, there's a scenario here where the level of hostility of the world has gone up with respect to the human being. And most human beings are so despondent about their own nature, knowing very little about themselves, that they basically think that this is an improvement. So those are the two factors that I'm aware of. And there's probably another one, but let's just say that anything after this is probably a rounding error.
Yeah, in a sense, that second reason is a loss of trust in ourselves.
Yeah, because we don't know who we are. And this is the thing. It's like at this point, most people, like if I walk into a given room, for example, 10, 15 years ago, and I basically tried to determine whether they were neurologically aware, like did they understand that different neurological processes like autism could result in different behavioral things? Yeah, they might barely understand that. Or different chemistry processes, different biochemistry could result in different things, or trauma can result in different things. Like, unless you understand the phenomenology of how we learn, how does anybody expect to actually have compassion for one another, let alone themselves? Right? Like there's a sense here in which, honestly, I think the answer, the thing that we're trying to, I, as an individual, can't be the holder of an answer. All I can really do is to say, here's a direction that if we move in this direction, we collectively become more capable of creating the answer either within ourselves or within the world. So we have to, in effect, become the answer. We can't know the answer. We have to, in a sense, embody it. We have to contextualize ourselves in a way that is a kind of distributed organism that has a collective awareness with enough wisdom to actually respond to the world in a way that makes sense. And you need more contact between human beings, one another, and human beings and nature itself for that to even become possible. So that's the direction we need to go in.
So people want lots of choices. Maybe people want asymmetric choices, but they don't know what to choose. And somehow those two dynamics are inflating the bubble that's continuing to push in the direction of maximize causation, maximize power without enabling, developing, cultivating wisdom.
They know that they want, they just don't know what. And they haven't become aware of themselves enough to know the difference between want, need, and desire. Because even then, it's like there's a conflation. We think in terms of wants, but really it's about desire. Not even need. Like that's a whole other conversation. At which point I would suggest refer to the Delicate Fire notes, because that podcast has that description filled out.
Great. Okay. Well, I'll put a link to that. Yeah, I do. I have found it extremely worthwhile to think in terms of want, need, and desire. I was reading in some of Marx's writings that, you know, his analysis does seem to be reduced to want, but it's very common that all those three are collapsed into that. And of course, we do have intuitive senses of, you know, need being distinct from want and all the rest of it. But I agree with you. It is very much worthwhile. All right. Well, it feels like that's an appropriate place to bring that to a close there. And just thank you, Forrest.
Most welcome. Thank you for this delightful conversation, where your willingness to listen in humility to me pontificate. I appreciate that.